Before watching this video, make sure that you watched our previous video and you know how to find x when given a probability by hand and using a standard normal table. And so we're going to solve those problems now using a graphing calculator. So if we go to second vars, we're going to be using the inverse normal function, and this is to solve for x when you're given a probability. So in our first example, we were given a probability of 0.375, and the mean in the problem was 150, and the standard deviation was 25. And this was a less than probability given to us, so you're going to keep it as a left tail distribution if you're using a TI-84. But if you're using a TI-83, this is how you'll type the problem into the calculator, but you will not have the left tail option. So if we go ahead and enter that in, you'll get your x value that we solved for in the previous video. And if we repeat this process but now want to solve for a greater than probability, so in our second example we were given that 0.375 was a greater than probability and we want to solve for x. So in the same function, if you have a TI-84, you can actually keep these values and just use the right tail curve, and this will give you a greater than probability. And if we paste that in, it'll give you your x value. If you have a TI-83, you will not have the option to turn it into a greater than probability, and so you need to take 1 minus 0.375, which in our case is 0.625. We have the same mean and standard deviation, and a TI-83 will automatically read it as a left tail problem. And so for a TI-83 without this final option, this is what your calculator should read, and notice that we get the exact same x value. So there are two options when doing a greater than problem. Finally, if we do an in-between problem, again, if you have a TI-84, you have the option of tails. And so in our problem, we were given that 60% of the curve was bounded by two x variables, and we had a mean of 150 and a standard deviation of 25. And if you're looking for those two x values, if you have a TI-84, you can actually click this center option. And so if we paste that in, notice that we get our two x values as 128.9 and 171.04, which is very close to what we solved for by hand. But if you have a TI-83, you do not have the center option, and so you need to watch the previous video on how I figured out my less than probabilities for x1 and x2. But since that was already covered in the previous video, you can actually use 20% falls below x1, and it'll be a left-hand curve. And then if I go back and solve for x2, I knew that 80% fell below x2. And so you would just have to go through the extra step of solving for both of these values separately. But again, in both cases, we're getting the exact same values as we did for the center problem, so you can use either of these methods.